My guest contacted me over the summer, out of the blue, looking for a Christian college to potentially connect with in some way. I was more than happy to hear from him. Chris Lim is an adjunct professor at the University of Alabama School of Social Work, where he serves as project director for the Alabama Uniform Integrated Human Trafficking Initiative. After a 14-year career in law enforcement with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, Chris began working with various nonprofit organizations to serve victims of human trafficking. He has served internationally in the Middle East, Kenya, Cambodia, and the Philippines in an undercover capacity, and as security consultant in efforts to end human trafficking and help victims to recover. He'll speak on both local and global concerns with this issue, which you can see because it says "global" right there in the name. So please welcome Chris Lim.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm going to see if I can. Well, I was going to mess with the volume, but I fear messing things up, so I won't. And thank you, Dr. Parks, for allowing me to be here today. And I did reach out because I love collaboration, and I think collaboration is a key aspect of the solution for the issue of human trafficking, both locally and globally. And I've been involved, I guess, full-time in the work of anti-human trafficking for the past about 7 years. And in that time, I've had the blessing to be able to do a lot of different types of things, and so it's given me a broad perspective on the issue from really almost any kind of perspective that you can have. So I was at a meeting Tuesday with somebody, and they were asking me if I felt that I could speak the language of law enforcement and of nonprofits, and I said, yes, that's what I do. I kind of translate between these two groups. And so I've just been blessed with that opportunity. You guys can still hear me, I'm assuming? I don't know what happened. Maybe somebody turned my voice down. So I often get questions from students or from young people or people that are beginning their professional careers about, well, how can I be involved in anti-human trafficking work? Or conversely, how did you get involved in this type of work? And so I'm going to start just by answering that first question by giving you just kind of a little bit more of my history, my story, and then the second question about what can we do or how can we be involved in this issue will be answered, hopefully, as we go through this conversation today and as we get to the end. And if it's not, like Dr. Park said, we can definitely talk about what some opportunities or options might be. But I have a unique, I guess, professional background that doesn't make any sense at all if you kind of look at my CV. I started as a young professional, if you will, in law enforcement, and I spent 14 years working with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. While I was on the Sheriff's Department, I began working with what we called at that time at-risk youth or at-risk teenagers. Basically this population that at that time we didn't know, but a lot of them were probably being involved in human trafficking at some level as well. And through this program, I realized that these kids and their families needed ongoing support. They needed more than just what this one program could offer. And so I started this nonprofit organization, and after a few years, it got to the point where I had to decide if I was going to leave law enforcement and work for this nonprofit, or if I was going to stay in law enforcement. And so I chose to leave law enforcement and pursue this work with the nonprofit. And in a lot of ways, that changed the trajectory of my life. Although not in an immediate factor, because I quickly realized that I could not feed my family on what you make working at a nonprofit organization. And so from there, I got into business, and I was working in the business world for a number of years. And then God brought an opportunity back to me to come back into nonprofit work, and specifically working with victims of human trafficking. And that was with an organization in Los Angeles. It's called Saving Innocence, great organization. They do amazing work. And they work with minors who are victims of sex trafficking, kind of in the greater Southern California area. And so that's really where I began to learn and understand really in depth of what this issue is all about, how it impacts people, how we can help them, what changes need to be made systemically to address different issues around this, and all of that. I also did work for a short time for an organization in Tennessee called End Slavery Tennessee, and they are another amazing organization. They work with all victims of human trafficking, so both sex and labor trafficking, males and females, adults and minors, and they operate safe houses and do a lot of really great things. And then kind of the third aspect of what I've been able to do was a little bit of international work where I was able to do a lot of different things. So we mentioned the undercover work. You'll see some pictures from that. There's some training that I've been able to do as of late around labor trafficking and different things like that. And so I've been able to have this broad kind of perspective. Well, 3 years ago, the School of Social Work at the University of Alabama was awarded a grant from the Department of Justice to research what's going on with human trafficking here in Alabama, and then to create a statewide human trafficking protocol. And that's what I've been doing for the past 3 years. It's been amazing. It's been a lot of fun and very challenging. And we actually just finished it up. And we are actually disseminating the report now. And so that's been a great, that's been just a huge blessing that I've been able to be a part of. And if you'd like a copy of that report, feel free to email me or whatever, and I could shoot that to you. The issues that we're going to talk about today, though, are really, I'm going to answer 3 questions. One is, what is human trafficking? Now, I know that in any audience, you're going to have a diversity of experience and knowledge around the issue. And so what I'm going to try to do in our talk today is give enough information so that people that really don't know anything about human trafficking will have at least a good understanding of what human trafficking is, what causes it, what are some potential solutions. And in doing that, I'm also going to try to not give so much information that I bore those of you that really understand the issue. And so I'll try to walk that balance today. But the second question that we're going to talk about is, what are the implications for the church and the believer based on our understanding of what human trafficking is and how it occurs? What are the things that the church can be doing strategically to address the issue? And then finally, more of a focus on us as individuals and taking a look at the question of, what about me? What can I do? Regardless of my profession, my role, my career, you know, not everybody's going to have a job where they're working full-time in anti-human trafficking work. Most of us don't. And so what does that mean for me? What if I'm an accountant, or I'm in communications, or I'm in marketing or sales? Can I have any sort of impact? So we're going to talk about that as well. But I think most of the time when we think of human trafficking, these images from over there come to our mind, right? We think of things like we think of things like maybe like brothels in Cambodia. So these are some storefronts in Cambodia, and maybe images like that come to our mind, or maybe like seedy bars and clubs and things like that where some of this might take place. You know, there was a movie that came out probably like 15 or 20 years ago now. I don't know. Taken? You guys seen that movie? Liam Neeson? Yeah. Okay. So that comes to our mind, right? Because most people, when they think of human trafficking, they think of something like this, where, you know, brothels, where these girls are forced to work in there and all of that. Sometimes we think of like big business. So this was drawing a blank. I think this was the Philippines, and we took this picture because the gentleman standing here, does this work? Let me see if my little pointer works. Okay. The gentleman standing there was my partner, and they partnered us together because there are some clubs, and in this case, what's called a karaoke club or a KTV, that that only certain people were allowed in, and in this case, there were Korean clubs that only Koreans were allowed in. I'm not Korean. I'm half Chinese. I don't speak any Korean, but my partner did, and he does. He's Korean and he speaks fluently, and so he was our ticket in, right? But what we did in some of these operations was we were going into these different brothels, massage parlors, and that sort of thing to gather intelligence. We were trying to figure out how they did their operations, kind of get an idea of how many victims were there, and just as much information as we can. And often what it would be is we would have like a list of about 7 different locations that we needed to hit each night. And we would spend anywhere from maybe 30 minutes to an hour in the location trying to get as much intelligence as we could, and then we'd move on to the next one. Well, as we were approaching this one, this was a big building. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a really nice building. Multi-stories, and there were these buses that were pulling up and unloading a bunch of Korean businessmen. So dozens and dozens of these Korean businessmen. And so that's why we had him stand out front there and just take a picture of that so we can kind of document, you know, the clientele, the Johns that were coming in there, just so they got an idea of what this particular establishment was doing. But it reinforces and reminds us that this is big business and that there's a lot of money to be made in human trafficking as an industry. But it's not always like this. It's not all fancy places like this. Sometimes it's small and rural communities. So this place, for example, was in a small village, and you walk kind of in this outdoor alleyway area that led into more of like a somewhat enclosed hallway that had rooms on each side, and these rooms were just little small, about the size of a storage shed, where the victims would be housed and abused. And so it's not always like these big fancy places. It's not always these little places like this. It runs the gamut of all different types of locations. Sometimes we think these examples that have been given are around sex trafficking, but there's labor trafficking as well. In fact, worldwide, labor trafficking is, there's probably more victims that are victims of labor trafficking than sex trafficking. And oftentimes when we think of that, we think of things like sweatshops where hundreds of people are being forced to work for maybe no wages or low wages or in terrible conditions and environments, and are perhaps physically, emotionally abused in other ways. This place, I don't know, it's hard to even tell in these pictures, but it goes back. This was a huge room, and just rows and rows and rows of these ladies that were sewing for a major brand that we're all familiar with. Or perhaps we think of things like bonded labor, where you have people that are working to pay off a debt, that their debt continues to grow because perhaps their trafficker is providing them a place to live and providing them with food and things like that. And so maybe they get paid $200 a week, and yet their charges for their room and board and all of that is maybe $250 a week. And so even though they're getting paid, they're accruing a debt of $50 each and every week. And that gets passed down generationally so that their families will be in bondage and enslaved, quite literally, for generations to come. So these are some images or pictures of human trafficking that I think come to our mind. And they're real. I mean, these things do happen. And they happen not only over there, overseas and in other countries and all of that, but they happen right here in the United States. How many of you are from Alabama? A couple, okay. So if you're from Alabama or you're from wherever you're from, human trafficking is probably occurring in your community, in a city, large or small, anywhere near you. And so 3 years ago, I came here to Alabama to kind of to do some research on that and to figure out what is the prevalence and the scope of human trafficking in this state for the purpose of creating a statewide human trafficking protocol. And so I thought it'd be important to get a look at what's going on throughout the entire state. So we ended up conducting focus groups. And we did 20 focus groups in 12 cities. There's the 13th city, you might be counting those and saying, why is Demopolis kind of grayed out a little bit? We were scheduled to do a focus group there, but people didn't show up. and so there was a scheduled focus group, but it ended up taking place down in Mobile instead. But I wanted to get an idea of what does human trafficking look like throughout the entire state? Not just the big cities, not just kind of, some of you may have heard of like the I-20 superhighway and things like that. But what's really going on geographically throughout the state? I also wanted to hear from people that are actually working with victims of human trafficking. So it was important to be able to get an accurate perspective of what human trafficking actually looks like. So I wanted to not just talk with people that understand what human trafficking is, or that maybe they're kind of the person that if their agency got wind of a victim of human trafficking, that they might be the person to address that, but people that have actually worked with them. We ended up having 114 of these kind of frontline professionals involved in these various focus groups. And they were from all different disciplines. They were, a lot were from law enforcement, from child welfare, from mental health, from the CACs. There were educators there, the faith community was there, nonprofit organizations were there, some policymakers were there. It ran the gamut. And so it was fantastic because we were able to really see from all of these different perspectives what human trafficking really looks like in the state. And so we asked them a series of just open-ended conversational questions. We didn't ask them like, hey, could you bring us your data on human trafficking victims that your agency serviced? Because that data doesn't exist. There aren't agencies that are collecting that data. And if they did, there's no way to kind of communicate that data between systems statewide. And so because that was not an option, we just asked them questions. And we asked them questions that were designed around what human trafficking, what are the indicators of human trafficking? And began conversations with them around that. What we were able to find with all of these professionals is that regardless of where you're at in the state and regardless of the discipline that the people were from, that just about every form of human trafficking that exists out there in the world is happening to some degree right here in Alabama. And Alabama's not unique in that. You could probably say the same thing for just about every state in the nation. In particular, we were asking them to give us a snapshot of 2017. We conducted this research in 2018, 2 years ago. And so we were asking them, in the last year, if you think back on your practice, whether you're a counselor or whatever it is, how many times did you run into somebody that displayed these types of characteristics? Those types of questions. And what we discovered is that in 2017, in Alabama alone, there were over 1,100 potential victims of human trafficking that were represented by those 114 professionals. Now, I mentioned potential victims because, again, these were not people that maybe were, that were rescued out of a human trafficking situation, and so they were getting services. These were not people that kind of approached maybe a social service provider and said, hey, I'm a victim of human trafficking, can you help me? these weren't people that necessarily that law enforcement found, because they were doing a raid or a sting or something. These were just people that were coming to nurses and receiving services, or going to a counselor and receiving services, or whatnot. And so not all of these 1,100 people were identified as victims of human trafficking. And so cases weren't opened, criminal cases weren't opened to try to find the traffickers and bring them to justice. Or social services weren't necessarily provided to help victims and survivors of human trafficking. Another thing that we discovered is that a lot of them were minors. About 57% of them were minors. And so we realized that in our state, there's a big problem with children being victims of human trafficking. One of the things I think that was an eye-opener to me that I didn't expect to find was in this category of prevalence of what's called familial trafficking. So a family member providing or offering the sexual services of a child in exchange for something of value. Sometimes that might be something like rent or a place to stay or food. Oftentimes it's something like drugs or alcohol or something else. But that's something that needs to be addressed, and talking with our partners around the state and with the folks at the Fusion Center and the state law enforcement agency, they really see this as one of the biggest problems that we need to really begin to address. Well, if the formula that the Global Slavery Index uses is correct, this 1,100 potential victims really probably only represents about 18% of the victims in the state of Alabama that are even having kind of these ancillary contacts with victim service providers, law enforcement, medical professionals, counselors, etc. So we have a long way to go, not just in Alabama, but really in every state, throughout our country and throughout the world. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around the issue of human trafficking. And so we've talked a bit about human trafficking in general, but let's just talk a little bit about what is it actually. And so I found this chart to be really helpful. Human trafficking is really a combination of an act, a means, and a purpose. And if you bring any one of these things together from these three categories, you have human trafficking, okay? So if you, for example, harbor somebody by the use of, deception for organ removal, you have human trafficking. Does that make sense? So you just piece them together. A way that we often look at this is the act is what is the exploiter or the trafficker doing? What are the actions that they're taking? The means is how are they doing that? And then the purpose obviously is either for labor, to have them do some sort of work, and or some sort of sexual or erotic services. Now, what we often do is this middle column of the means, we often just kind of, for simplicity's sake, generalize it into force, fraud, and coercion. Okay, so that's kind of the legal definition that is used not only here in Alabama but throughout the United States and really around the world. Something like this is typically used. But what does that look like? So let me tell you a story. This is Jennifer. She's 15. That's not her real. She's not a real person. Well, she's probably a real person, but it's just a story. Jennifer just had a fight with her mom, an argument, not a physical fight, but she's frustrated with her mom. Her mom's frustrated with her, and they have the big blowout, and they had, She's upset because mom never understands me, and she just doesn't get it, you know, and she makes a big deal out of everything, and so she goes up to her room and flops on her bed and pulls out her phone and opens up her favorite social media app, whatever that might be. You know, probably most everybody's using MySpace now, right? Is that, okay. And she just starts venting, you know, and she's getting on there, you know, just had a blowout with my mom. She doesn't get it. She doesn't get me. She doesn't understand anything. And so she's just venting. And that's a pretty typical thing. You know, I mean, I think to some degree, whether you're a 15-year-old girl or a 60-year-old man, you know, you probably do that to some degree. Vent, you know, you get frustrated and you vent somewhere. Well, how does that play into human trafficking? You know, we mentioned that in order to get somebody convicted of human trafficking, there has to be either force, fraud, or coercion, combination of those things, right? In the U.S., if you're under 18, those actually don't need to be proved. And in Alabama, if you're under 19, you don't need to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order for somebody to be convicted of human trafficking. However, those elements, some element of that will always be present. So what does that look like for Jennifer? Did I say Jennifer? Is that her name? We'll go with Jennifer. Okay. What does that look like for her? Well, perhaps there's a guy that sees her venting on social media, and it's like, you know what? I totally understand what you're talking about. I just had a blowout with my dad, and he doesn't get it either, you know, and I'm just really frustrated with him because, you know, I want to do these things, and he doesn't think that, you know, I'm either mature enough or adult enough or whatever to do. He doesn't get me. And she's all like, yeah, that's exactly how I feel, you know, and so he begins to build this connection with her through a shared experience, right? In this example, an emotional level of something that they're both kind of feeling together. And so he's all, you know what? You know, let's just forget about it, and we need to think of in times like this, you need to think of something good, right? And he becomes like very philosophical. Let's think about, you know, the good things that are going on in our lives and the opportunities that we have and what are our strengths and, you know, how can we build ourselves up and all of that. And, you know, Jennifer, what do you like to do? You know, and she's all, well, you know what? I think I sing pretty good, and I'd like to go on one of these shows. I think I could be like a famous singer, and I think I'm pretty good. And so he's all, really? Come on, let me hear. So she flips through, you know, Spotify or whatever, and pulls up a song, one of her favorite songs, and begins to sing along with it. And he's all, man, you're amazing. You got pipes. You really can sing. You got some talent. And he says, I happen to be able, I know talent when I see it, you know, and I think you're the full package. You've got the ability, you've got the looks, we could put it all together. And I really believe in you. I think that together we can do this. In fact, I know a guy that can give you voice lessons, and we could take you out and get your nails done and your hair done, get you some clothes so you look the part, and we can really make this work. And so, you know, and so now he's building this allegiance, this trust between them, right? And she's really feeling that he understands. And so they meet together and they develop a friendship. And this maybe takes a few days, a few weeks, a few months. I mean, if he perceives her to be a valuable enough target, he'll take as long as he needs to build this level of trust so that they can build this life together. And in fact, as they begin to do that, he begins to tell her, you know what, I got feelings for you. And I really think I love you. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to do something here. And she's thinking in her mind, you know, this guy, he's really treated me well, and he's been really nice, and he's fun to be around with, he's generous, he's kind, he understands me, he believes in me, he thinks I'm amazing, he loves me, and I really think I love him too. And so they develop this relationship. And you know, the relationship will turn sexual in, again, whatever time frame that he feels that he could push her towards that. Whether it's, hey, send me a picture of yourself, or, hey, you know, let's video ourselves or take pictures of ourselves together, and all of that. And she's like, she's uncomfortable. She's like, you know, I've never done this before, but I mean, this is what people do, I guess, when they're in love, right? And so, okay, yeah. And so she does that, right? Well, inevitably, the moment comes where, hey, you know what? I've lost my job, and I don't have the money to get your hair done and your nails done and to continue the voice lessons and all of that. But I know that we understand each other and we have this connection, and I believe in you, and our love is real, and so there's something that I need you to do for us so that we can have the money to be able to pursue your dreams and our goals together. And then he says, you know, I know this guy, and if you go to this party and, you know, just go home with them afterwards and sleep with them and stuff like that. She's all, wait, what do you mean sleep with them? I'm not gonna do that. Are you crazy? And he's all, listen, baby, I do love you, and I do believe in your talent because you are amazing, and you know, we have this kind of connection, and I have these pictures of you, and I'd hate for your parents to see these pictures, or I'd hate for them to go out on the internet and all your friends to see these pictures of you. But that might need to happen if you don't do this for us. This is important. We need to reach your goals. I believe in you. I love you, and you love me. And so she hates herself, but she loves him, and so she does it. And then he has her trapped. And this story, although, you know, I obviously just kind of made it all up, is actually how human trafficking most often happens here in the United States. Some story like this. And so how does this happen? I think when you boil it down, it's really just somebody exploiting the vulnerabilities of somebody else. And that's what he did in this example, right? He targeted and found and manipulated vulnerabilities that she had, and exploited those. Well, what do some of these look like? Well, they run the gamut. It could be poverty. It could be early sexual abuse of children. It could be our systems. It's unhealthy families, girls being objectified, the normalization of the sexualization of children in our society, the pimp culture. There's a million. I mean, I could fill this screen up with potential vulnerabilities of human trafficking. And we could talk about any one of these for a long time. Each and every one of them are things that we see in our culture and that are pervasive in the things that kids see today and that we see on a daily basis. I think that fundamentally, though, at the base of it, and at the risk of kind of oversimplifying it, there's two broad categories that these vulnerabilities fall under: economic and relationships. So in economics, that's where we see things like the bonded labor or the domestic servitude, you know, the sweatshops, things like that. In fact, a lot of companies and industries have taken efforts towards trying to make sure that they're sourcing all of their stuff through ethical means and things like that, right? To try to mitigate this aspect of human trafficking. There's also the relational, and that's the example that I just gave you. And it can be, there might be a combination of relational and financial or economic factors, but the thing with the relational aspects, I think, is twofold. One is they're often harder to identify, right? I have a teenage daughter, and if she brought somebody home, probably those of us that are a little more seasoned might remember Eddie Haskell. Okay, if my daughter brought Eddie Haskell home, and for those of you that don't know who Eddie Haskell is, he was a little scoundrel kid that always seemed very pleasant, very nice, and always was very polite to his friends' parents and all of that. And so the parents loved him, right? And so if my daughter brought home this young man who was very nice and engaging and polite and treated her well and got her hair done and her nails done and gave her clothes and all of that, well, my antennas would go up. But a lot of dads might be like, wow, this is a really nice guy. He's much better than the last one or whatever. And so it's hard to identify, right? But on the other hand, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, on the other hand, it gives us an opportunity because it's very, in a sense, easier to mitigate those aspects of it than the economic aspects of it. Just being a good friend and being, a good counselor for a family member or a friend. What are the implications for us? What does this mean for us if there was an opportunity for the church to do something strategic to address this issue, what might that look like? And so let's just talk about two things. One is preventative and one is restorative. So first, preventative. If we think that a lot of these vulnerabilities revolve in general around relational type things and or economic type things, there's a lot of different ministries or things that we can do in our community and through our churches, even as individuals, that can make a difference in that, right? I kind of mentioned off the top of my head just like being a good friend, but that's not to be downplayed. That's really real, We've got, especially now when there's so much separation and isolation, there's a lot of people that are discouraged and depressed and just going through really tough times. Well, there's things that we can do to be good friends, to know what their fears are, what their aspirations are, what their hopes are, to hear their concerns, so that when Jennifer pops on her phone with her cell phone, she's not just going out to just anybody that's out there, but that you're the person that she calls and says, hey, you know what? I'm just really frustrated with my mom right now. Can I just vent with you? Things like that. That seem like what does that have to do with human trafficking? Well, if that's the vulnerability that a trafficker is going to exploit, and you're a good friend and a listening ear and providing wise counsel, then that goes a long way towards preventing that, right? What about restorative things? Again, there's a lot of impact that we can have with our churches or as individuals that can help victims of human trafficking. So we can support local, national, international nonprofit organizations that are doing good work. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that, not just financially, although they'll take your money, they need your money, so do that if you can. But you can support them through giving your expertise or your knowledge. If you're somebody that's a good marketer or something like that, they probably all need somebody to help with their social media game and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different things that we can do to be restorative and help. I think just as an individual, you can get get trained in how to understand how trauma affects victims of human trafficking. What does that look like in the church, and how do we do that well in terms of like treating people that are suffering through trauma? We can help with figuring out, maybe we could start a program to help people learn and develop marketable job skills, once they've been recovered from a trafficking environment. So that's maybe what we could do as a church. What about us as individual believers? And I think there's 3 things that I'm going to share here. One is be accurate. There's a lot of misinformation that goes around about human trafficking. And, some of it, the devil seems to have like two schemes that he likes a lot, right? One is mixing in enough truth so that it seems plausible, So before you forward, the next story about, human trafficking that you get on social media, maybe, look into it a little bit more, ask somebody that you may know about that's involved in human trafficking or reach out to an organization, say, I just saw the story, does this seem true? So that's one. The other one is, I think that that a tactic that he uses is having us confuse biblical compassion and justice with a lot of these social justice issues that are going on in the world today. And that might sound funny for me, because that's what I've been doing with my life for the past several years, right? And I teach at University of Alabama, human trafficking and all of that. But human trafficking really is in my mind, less of a social justice issue than it is a human rights issue. If we think of it in terms of this person is a human being created in the image of God, that's infinitely more important than some of these other social justice issues that we tend to gravitate around and focus on. So be accurate. Next is be prayerful. The people that are involved in the work of human trafficking, they need encouragement and support. Policymakers need wise counsel and discernment. And victims or survivors of human trafficking, they need protection and restoration. And so you can pray around all of these different issues. You can pray, like I mentioned, some of the organizations that are doing this work. Pray for them. And then finally, be reflectors of God's glory. I think that in my work, I've been blessed with being able to see a lot of different organizations that work around human trafficking. And it's interesting because just as the church was strongly involved in the abolitionist movement to free the slaves, about, 10, 15 years ago or so, when really we started becoming more and more conscious of human trafficking, it was the church that rose up and did that, right? It was the church that formed nonprofit organizations and ministries and different things, by and large, that have done this. And I think today, oftentimes, many of these organizations are afraid to name the name of Christ. And worse, we do all of these great things, and we do all of these really good things that help a lot of people, and then all of the glory goes to us. Like, yeah, we did all, look at all the people that we rescued, or look at all, all the stuff that we did. But in Matthew, what are we told in Matthew 5:16? Let your light shine in such a way that they see your good works, but then they glorify your Father in heaven, right? And ultimately, that's what it comes down to, is that if the good things that we are doing is just drawing attention to ourselves or our programs or, the issue that we like, we're robbing God of his glory. And so be a reflector of God's glory as we approach this issue as well. So I'm going to end there so that we have time for some questions if there are any. And I know that some of you are going to need to buzz out of here in the next few minutes. And so if you have any questions, or if there's folks in the overflow room, I'm not sure how we do that. But I'd be happy to entertain any questions. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I'll need to restate the question so those in the overflow room can hear what's being asked. Right. Okay. The question is, what's the difference between the definition of slavery and human trafficking?
It's a great question. So, as of late, a lot of people have been talking about human trafficking in terms of modern day slavery. And so, when you hear modern day slavery, a lot of times that's what they're referring to. And the reason why is because there's a lot of similarities between what we think of as slavery. And typically when we think of slavery, we're thinking of those 400 years during the transatlantic slave trade, frankly, is what we think of. All the slavery's been happening, I mean, in the Bible, we see it from the very beginning, you know, that people were enslaved. And so slavery has always been around, but the things that make it common are kind of those factors, you know, that we saw in that little blue graphic, where there is a means and there's an action for the purpose.
And by the way, if you're an undergrad student, you need to get to class. You know, this would be a good time to exit. And a reminder of combo credit. Anna's back there. Other question? Okay, Caleb.
So thinking about going to see some family members for Thanksgiving, your point on being accurate, when you talk to people who maybe are believing some things that are maybe more conspiracy and distracting away from like the real problem, how do you approach that or address that?
So the question is, how do you talk with family and other people about conspiracy theories related to this topic? How do you deal with that issue?
For me, it's probably a little bit easier than it might be for you, because just because like I'm a perceived expert, you know what I mean? And so if I say that something is not accurate, then they're probably going to believe me, whereas if you say it, you might have to prove it a little bit more, right? And so there's a lot of sources that you can go to try to validate these things. It's really hard, honestly. I mean, there's so many different things that come out, and you're not going to find really on any kind of website or agency source a description of the latest, you know, the latest thing. But if you go on some government websites, a lot of times they will have Q&As, but ask people. I mean, you could call up organizations that actually work with victims and say, I've seen this, do you think that's true? And that's one way that you could do that.
Okay, Teal.
Speaking specifically like in the church and youth, what age do you think is appropriate to like in a youth group kind of approach, look out like specifically? I mean, it's different to say don't talk to somebody online. And then also, are there programs that youth leaders can use in a church to educate youth to kind of be on the lookout for this?
Okay, so the question is, what is age appropriate when teaching about human trafficking, and then what are some programs and material to help teach about human trafficking?
Yeah, so programs and materials, it can be more difficult. There are a lot out, actually, but you just have to look for them. You have to know where they're at. I would go to sources like Shared Hope International. They have some good stuff. Exodus Cry, which has received some bad press recently, has some good stuff. So there are organizations, a lot of national organizations and some regional, that have good content. But in terms of like you dealing specifically with it in a youth group or something like that, you know, age appropriate, it would be an important thing. And I think you don't need, especially with this issue, you don't need to talk about the issue directly per se in order to be effective. You know, we could, just using the example that I gave of Jennifer, you know, you can just talk about stuff like that, and with your youth group. Hey, when you're frustrated, what's a good way to handle that? What should we do? You know, and talk about things like that that will help them learn how to deal with the issues.
Okay.
2 weeks ago, there was a report out of Jasper where workers were people who were bringing them were putting them in Jasper homes that they had purchased, charging them exorbitant rents, charging them a lot of other fees, plus the cost of getting them there and for the job. What can a church in a community do about a specific situation once it has become public knowledge?
So the question is, there's a specific story in Jasper of human trafficking related to a chicken plant and people living in the area. And the question is, what can you do, what can a church do about something like this once it becomes public knowledge?
In our research, one of the things that we found was there was probably about a dozen different countries that were represented that victims of human trafficking came from in the state of Alabama. And so there's probably more of that going on than we want to know, really. And there are some distinct opportunities, whether or not it comes to light. You know, I think there's things that churches can do that, that can help those people. Now, when you're dealing with a victim of human trafficking, you need to understand the areas of trauma. So I think a church probably should really be aware of how trauma affects populations as well, and how it affects systems, and how it affects your church as you try to reach out to them. But I think that in situations like that, there's opportunities for church, again, kind of like with the youth group, to address it without having to address it head on. Your church can offer different services to those victims, or even just not even assuming that they're victims, the people that are working in these plants. You know, they may be, we discovered that there was a lot from several different South American countries. And so maybe having somebody that speaks one of those languages in your church, start a ministry of outreach to them, you know, where you start a Bible study if they're allowed to do that, or start some sort of a, you know, learning an English program if they're allowed to do that. Different things like that that you can do in the community where you're not necessarily going to that business and saying, hey, I know that you have trafficking victims and we're going to rescue them, because that's not going to go well for you. But maybe if you offer services as a church, that might be a way to do it. Although you're going to have resistance from the business that's bringing them in, for sure.
I have a question, because you just reminded me of a scenario that I encountered as I was overseeing an ESL program. I just noticed the relationship between an American husband and a foreign wife that, to me, brought up some questions. And so there's nothing that I could possibly say, oh, I know he's trafficking, but I just had some questions. Do you or anyone else do training for people just to spot it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So funny thing is, I have a friend who's a white guy, and his wife is Asian, and she looks a lot younger than him. And he's been frustrated several times because people have thought that he was trafficking her, and he really wasn't. He's not. But I think things that we could look for in a situation like that, or really any relationship, are some of those indications of unhealthy relationships in general. So in the example that I gave of Jennifer, I didn't get into the full explanation, but there's going to be times when the trafficker then will begin to have the victim separate from family, from friends, from their structures, from their systems, from their church or whatever. So when you begin to see things like that, so looking for the signs and the indications that there's an unhealthy relationship taking place. Yeah,
I feel the need to explain myself now. So that there was they really couldn't communicate much at all, and so the opportunity for a relationship did not seem that great, and there was a serious economic dependence. There were multiple things like that made me wonder. I treated them with love and respect, but yeah, that's. I'm glad you brought up that point, because then you can go to the other extreme.
Yeah, well, but those are indicators, right?
Yeah.
And so those things that you brought, those 2 or 3 things, are things that you would look out for and say, well, there's something suspicious here. Yeah.
Okay, good. I feel validated. We can end now. All right. Thank you so much for coming. And this is our last Global Voices of the semester, and I hope to see you next semester. And again, if you want to connect with Chris Lim, please hang out. Thank you again for coming.